All right, we are live. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up. I am live with naval historiographer Drakenifel. How are you doing,
Hello.
Drak?
I'm doing quite well. We managed, well, it's kind of a so far so good this week. I managed not to die horribly in a plane crash coming back from Jersey, so I'm 100% on not falling out of the sky on fire so far, which is always good.
Hey, that's a
Um,
win.
yeah, and then a couple of days later, we had possibly the most intense storm that I've seen in this area of the world. Um, like proper flash flood level storm where the water was just pouring down so quickly the drainage systems could deal with it if it was sort of when the storm died. The water went away within about 5 minutes,
Oh,
but it was
wow.
just coming down, so it was coming down so hard that the sort of the immediate flow of the drains couldn't take it, so there were literally roads turned into rivers.
Well, that's crazy. That's crazy. I'm
Yeah.
glad you survived that.
So I think I had my first operational ship command, even if it was my car, given the fact I drove about 2 miles with a constant sort of 6 foot rooster trail of water either side of the car.
Well, with your naval experience, at least that gives you some kind of skills to deal with that, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, so you are a naval historiography YouTube channel,
Hmm.
and you do some great stuff. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your channel?
Okay, so yeah, obviously Drakenifel is the YouTube name. Drakenifel's the channel name. Everything is Drakenifel. Kind of like that Mel Brooks sketch from Spaceballs. um, So I haven't yet invented Drakenifel the flamethrower, although it's not for lack of trying. But so yeah, I run the channel. It's been going for almost 5 years now, I think. Um, it seems to be doing pretty well for itself at the moment. And
Sure
yeah,
is.
yeah, my background is actually as an engineer. That's what I trained to do at university, and that's what I spent most of my day job career doing. But apart from having a love of engineering, I had a much longer standing pre existing love of naval history. And that goes back to when I was about age 4. But the simple fact of the matter is that I was being a relatively pragmatic person when it came to what I was going to study at uni. So I knew I wanted to study either history or engineering. But when I went to the various course open days that they had, and I was talking to the various course supervisors, one of the questions I always asked them was roughly what percentage of your graduates actually get a job in the field that they study?
Hmm.
And sadly, for the history courses, it was catastrophically low. The only course that I asked that question on, which had an even lower uptake of people with the degree going into that field, was aeronautical engineering,
Wow.
hilariously enough, which had a roughly 4% ratio of people who passed versus people who actually got into that industry. Which, I mean, that was a thing I was also seriously thinking of studying, but at that rate of job finding, I thought no. So it came down eventually to mechanical or civil engineering, and I decided to go for civil because civil
Sure.
engineering was much better career prospects. Which, to be honest, that held true for as long as I decided to do engineering. But I was always doing my history bits and pieces in the background.
Excellent. There you go. Do you have naval history in your family? Is that one of the reasons that got you into?
Yes, there's naval history in the family from my grandfather's generation going back a fair old distance. On my on my paternal grandfather's side of things, I've actually been relatively fortunate when it comes to learning about family history because they appear to have spent pretty much the entirety of the last 1,000 years in some way, shape, or form in the military,
Sure.
whether that be feudal military or the brief period as minor nobility, and then into serving and obviously once the regular standing army and the Royal Navy had been set up, serving in those capacities. And yeah, there's random army and navy people all through sort of 1400s through to, say, my grandfather's generation, people in what counted for armies before that as well. So,
Sure.
although I only found all of this out afterwards, I'd say my interest in naval history went back to when I was 4. I only started doing serious ancestry research in my mid-20s. But it was a nice thing. It was a nice thing to discover, and it kind of then I thought, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe it's in your blood is one of the reasons you got interested in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and of course, European military is quite common throughout the entire history, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that actually makes, in my particular case, makes the family ancestry research so much easier. Because I know there's a little bit of a tangent, but when you're dealing with UK family history, the existing records are usually pretty good back to about the mid 1700s. And then there's a gulf. I'm not entirely sure why there's a gulf, but a lot of people's attempts to trace their ancestry stop in the early 1700s because they just can't find any more information. And then there's another sort of burst of records in the 1500s, early 1600s, which can be quite useful, but you've got to clear that gap.
Sure.
And if you can't clear that gap, if your family was just, bakers or farmers or some other normal occupation, chances are, unless you get very lucky, those records haven't survived or possibly weren't even made. And you're kind of stuck at that point. Whereas when you've got lots of people doing military service, they show up all over the place in muster rolls and pay rolls and citations and the occasional court martial and all sorts of documents. So it's far, far easier to trace them back over these gaps in the more civilian-based records.
Yeah, paperwork seems to be a very, very common thing in the military. They like their records, which kind of understandable. So your icon that you're using right now, that is you. That you look exactly like that guy, don't you?
I think I look vaguely like. As people have said, I look vaguely like the face. I don't have the giant handlebar moustache, unfortunately.
You could have one, if you wanted to.
Possibly, yeah. I could try at one point, I suppose. The main thing is having the handlebar moustache would involve shaving my beard, which I don't particularly want to do. Sure,
that makes sense. A good, strong, manly beard is something that people appreciate.
It's one of those things actually that I was at a falconry display, weirdly enough, of all places, and the chap who's doing the falconry display, he showed off 2 falcons, one of which was actually the father of the other one. And he pointed out that this, I think it was a Gaia falcon, it's got magnificent plumage. And then his son, the little Gaia falcon that was just learning how to display, was still in its juvenile plumage and looked a lot duller, obviously for camouflage when they're vulnerable. And then he was asking for volunteers, so one person to hold a glove to hold one, and then he'd hold the other. So of course I volunteered because I love animals generally, but birds of prey especially. And when he saw that I was one of about 3 people with beards out of an audience of 50, he said, right, and here you see an example of a human with their adult plumage.
Very nice. Very nice. Where does HMS Splendid come from?
It's a two-part illusion. So one part of it is, as people may or may not have picked up, I'm also quite into steampunk. And at least in the UK steampunk scene, the sort of the unofficial motto that's been adopted is "Be Splendid" to everybody. So that it kind of references that, and also because there is HMS Splendid. Well, there is. Well, I was going to say there isn't now, but it probably still is tied up on a wharf somewhere in either Plymouth or Rosyth. But there was an active Swiftsure class submarine called HMS Splendid, which a good family friend of ours served on. So the HMS Splendid aspect to it is a reference back to that as well.
Very nice. Have you ever wanted to design your own steampunk version of maybe a battleship HMS Splendid?
Oh, I've done that a few times.
You have?
Yeah, I've got. I mean, I'm as an engineer, I'm pretty good at technical drawing. I'm useless at what you might call art. But if you ask me to design ships or aircraft and things like that, I can something that's got hard angular lines and it is made by mechanisms that I can do. So yeah, I've come up with a variety of kind of steampunk-ish, I guess you'd call them, ships, mostly based on 1860s, 1870s ironclads.
You should do some kind of video about that. That might be pretty neat to see.
Yeah, maybe as a fun Friday at some point.
Very nice. So, young 4-year-old Drac, do you remember what got you into warship history in the first place?
So, I don't know if they have them in the States, but over here in the UK, they have, they had, I don't know if they still do, the Lady Bird series of books. I'm just thinking of it. They're about 6 inches high, 4 or 5 inches wide, pretty small books, basically a book that a child could hold. And they are kind of your condensed but relatively detailed kind of books. They're designed basically for kids who want to learn, to be able to learn to a level that they can comprehend. And they usually have a page of text and a bit of artwork that goes with it, and page of text, bit of artwork, page of text, bit of artwork. So they're quite engaging for kids. I really liked reading them as a toddler, and my grandmother bought a whole series of the history series that they did because she already knew I liked history. And one of the ones I kept coming back to the point I eventually wore the spine out and it fell apart was the Lady Bird history book for Admiral Nelson.
Sure.
Which of course had loads of pictures of the various battles he was in, etc. And so when I was 4, she said, okay, well, we're going to go out for a Saturday. I was like, okay, I don't know where we're going, but, a day out is a day out. This is all good. So we got on the train in London and headed on down to Portsmouth, which is where the National Museum of the Royal Navy is based. And on a rare, for the UK, sunny day, I was introduced at age 4 to the glories of fully rigged HMS Victory in the sunlight.
Wow.
And
that must have been a sight.
Yeah, when you're 4, everything seems so much larger. Victory is still an impressive sight, don't get me wrong, perhaps less so now that they've de-rigged her and taken away one of the masts for preservation, but she's still an impressive sight even as an adult. But as an adult, you do get an impression of the relative size. She's a big wooden ship, but there's a lot of other bigger things around, including elements of the modern day Royal Navy that are usually more just up the quayside.
Sure.
And but back when you're 4, something that size, it just fills your entire world of vision. And it just seems so massive. And I think at the time one of the Invincible class aircraft carriers was in, but to be honest, to a 4-year-old mind, those things would, even though obviously we know modern day the Invincibles weren't the world's biggest carriers, but to a 4-year-old mind, with them in the background, it was just like, oh, it's a grey wall that happens to go up sort of part way up into the sky. You don't have that kind of comprehension of what it is. Really, it's too big for you to comprehend.
Yeah.
And so the biggest thing that you can understand at that age is something about the size of Victory, and it makes a big impression. So after that was basically it. I was hooked.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Yeah, there's big sailing warships. There's something about them that captures the imagination, especially that they don't make them anymore. Like you said, they make them gray. They make them very industrial. Very utilitarian. There was a bit of art to the old warships.
Well, I mean, as Dr. Fred Hocker, who supervises the Vasa Museum, said in one of the interviews that we did on the videos I've done about the Vasa so far, it's like the art. These warships were pieces of art, and they had a purpose being pieces of art. It wasn't just a case of, well, we built a warship, now we're going to spend unnecessary money making it look pretty. Right. They were designed to look good in order to look intimidating.
Right. Yeah. The Royal Navy, of course, has a reputation to maintain as well.
Yes, exactly. And to be perfectly honest, not just the sort of intimidation and reputation aspect. It's also, to be perfectly honest, how on earth do you tell who is who in the heat of battle? You have to make your ship visually distinct so everyone knows that whose side you're on.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. Do you have a favorite era in warships? Is it the ships of the line era, like like the Victory?
I would have to say probably my favorite era is the latter half of the 19th century, because there's a lot of stuff to pick up and like in World War I and World War II. There's a lot of stuff to like in the Age of Sail, but I think the latter part of the 19th century, there's such a massive amount of innovation going on, so much technological progress, so much experimentation that leads to these absolutely weird and wonderful collection of warships, almost no two of which are in any way, shape, or form compatible.
I completely agree. Yeah, it's that pre-dreadnought era where all the technology is advancing and they don't know exactly what to do with it, so they're trying to throw everything together to basically figure out this new technology of warships.
Yeah, and it appeals to me in terms of the utter chaos that it represents, which I quite enjoy. But it also appeals to me as an engineer. It's like you can almost see the thought processes of the engineers that were involved in designing these things and how their thinking is evolving so rapidly. And the fact that, you could, in that era, you could say enter one of the naval academies to learn how to be a naval draftsman or something like that. And you could enter that in, say, 1860. Your first job upon graduation might be to design your navy or help design your navy's first or second ironclad. And you could finish your career 40 years later, sort of just about in time to see the launch of HMS Dreadnought and everything that went in between. It would have been a point where you could really enjoy it. It would almost be a different job every few years. Whereas with the best will in the world, if you would then take the 40 years thereafter, sort of 1906 to 1946, whilst you've probably seen that picture of the hulk of Oklahoma next to USS Iowa,
yes,
at Pearl Harbor, and you can see how much larger ships have got, and Oklahoma herself was considerably larger than Dreadnought. But at the end of the day, if you put USS South Carolina next to USS Iowa, there's not been anything like as much evolution at that point. You could look at the two and go, right, I can recognizably see these are two of the same kind of ship. It's just one is much bigger, effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas if you were to say to put HMS Warrior alongside Dreadnought, they're almost like they're from two completely different universes.
Oh yeah, or like one of your hotel, your French hotels.
Yeah,
pre-dreadnoughts, like those don't look like any other kind of battleship.
No.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you on that. I really enjoy the pre-dreadnought area, just like you said, all the wacky designs and things like that. I could tell you were kind of enjoying trying to get into the headspace. Like I'm going to go back to the French pre-dreadnought video because that's a really entertaining video. Just you know talking about these just wacky designs. And yeah, it seems like you were having a good time just trying to figure out what they were thinking of when they were going through that. Do you have a particular class of ship from that area, late ironclads or early pre-dreadnoughts that you particularly like?
It's a little bit of personal bias on my part, I must admit, but I do really like the Victoria class. HMS Victoria and HMS Sanspareil. I mean, for apart from anything else, if you look at my HMS Thunderchild hypothetical design, you will see, and look at HMS Victoria, you can see quite a lot of similarities, and that's not entirely accidental because they are from ostensibly the same era, and that whole sort of one massive turret forward to a couple of big guns, and then everything else is following on behind. It was a very brief trend in the Royal Navy, but they have that, for me, that balance of, if you were to look at them from the forward part, they look like a relatively modern warship. So if you showed someone a front-on view of Victoria or Sans Pari, they'd say, oh yeah, that's a battleship. But then when you look at them from the side-on view, they've still got that element of late 19th century craziness to them. Plus, let's say the personal bias on my part is because one of my slightly more distant ancestors was the captain of Sans Pari in her closing years.
Oh wow, that's impressive.
Mm. So yeah, they're my favorites.
Yeah, so I don't know if you could tell, but I may sound like I have a bit of an accent.
Just yeah, not as bad. I can understand you. You are comprehensible.
Okay, then that's a bonus. So I am actually from Maine. So we have two battleships, technically two battleships named from my state. One of the very first ones, although some consider the original Maine AC-1 to be an armored cruiser, and some consider it a battleship. Where do you fall in that?
It's a bit of an odd one for me because, by the standards of the day, bearing in mind that she's built in, well, they start building her in the 1880s, but she's a product of the 1890s. For a warship built in the 1890s, she's almost neither, because if you look at sort of when she's coming into service, so 1895, and then you look at, I'm just going to double check the commission date of HMS Majestic, so the first, what's usually classed as the first pre-dreadnought. So Maine is maybe 40% of Majestic's displacement. Not tremendously slower, to be perfectly fair, but her armor isn't. Her armor's okay, but for a battleship, slightly light. Her armament again is slightly light, and she does have this slightly odd arrangement of the turrets as well.
That on echelon configuration.
Yeah. And that's something that, to be honest, by the 1890s has gone away for battleships. They're beginning to develop at that point into what you would see as the classic pre-dreadnought, as exemplified by HMS Majestic. But you've got the Royal Sovereign class before that, and so on and so forth. You also, and then I mean, even if you compare her to a second-class battleship,
like Texas.
Staying with the Royal Navy, HMS Renown was a second-class pre-dreadnought, also launched in 1895, and she's still twice the displacement of Maine. She's considerably faster. They have the same notional armament in as much as they're both carrying 4 10-inch guns in a couple of twin turrets, but overall, if you look at them sort of armor protection, overall firepower, when you consider the secondary batteries, even a second-class battleship like Renown significantly outguns the Maine. But then you look at heavy cruisers of the period, armored cruisers it should be at that point, and Maine is still considerably more heavily armed than most armored cruisers. She's still considerably better protected than most armored cruisers, and she's also significantly slower than most armored cruisers. Yeah. So she sits in this weird place where she's a bit too heavy for an armored cruiser, but she's also definitely far too small and not powerful enough to be really even a second-class battleship. You'd almost want to call her either a third-class battleship or possibly a slow armored cruiser, but she doesn't fit either. But if I was going to put her in a battle line and sort of say, right, she's going with insert this class of ship, I'd probably tend towards putting her more in with the other armored cruisers rather
Sure.
than the battleships, and that's more on account of just the fact she would not survive in a straight up fight with the sort of the pre-dreadnoughts that were launching around the same time.
Sure. And you mentioned the gun configuration on the Maine. It did a similar setup on Texas as well. Could you kind of
Yes.
explain the on echelon configuration for people who might not be familiar with early battleships and armored cruisers?
Yeah, so she, the en echelon arrangement, it basically comes about from guns getting quite large, and in Maine's case, to be honest, also the hull being quite small. And with the vertical triple expansion engines and double expansion engines and even the single expansion engines that characterize ships of the period when the en echelon configuration is popular as the primary battery arrangement, effectively the engines take up too much room amidships. And if you were to stick the turrets fore and after that engine space, the ship becomes too long for the size that you're building it. And so by putting them en echelon, you can shorten the overall ship's hull because you can have the barbettes and the ammunition and the magazine handling, etc., off to one side of the machinery spaces. And by doing that, you get this shorter, cheaper, or possibly more affordable hull. And in theory, you still have a broadside because, again, in theory, you can fire across the deck. There's very, very few ships that were designed with en echelon turrets where that was actually reasonably practicable. They all could do it in notionally, but for most of them, it would turn out to be either at very, very limited angles of fire and or accepting the fact you're probably going to rip up your own deck by firing across it, especially in sort of Maine's era where you've got fairly short barrel guns.
Yeah, exactly. That was probably the big reason why on echelon configuration didn't carry on past those two.
Yeah, you see it revived briefly in early dreadnoughts and early battle cruisers, but that's about it, really. And even then, it's a secondary part of the battleship's armament. They have en echelon turrets, but they also have fore and aft turrets. They're not being forced into it because they absolutely have to. It's more just a desire for additional firepower. And as you say, the follow-on battleship Texas also had this configuration, albeit that the main difference, if you like, between USS Maine and USS Texas was that Maine had these twin 10-inch turrets. Texas had single 12-inch turrets. So ostensibly, it's a bit odd. In battle, given that they've got roughly the same armor, I'd probably actually give Maine a slight edge over Texas.
Really?
If you, yeah, well, because you've got double the main battery guns, which means that that's twice as many chances to hit. Now, granted, a single 12-inch hit from Texas would do more damage to Maine than a single 10-inch hit from Maine would do to Texas, but Maine's likely to score 2 or 3 hits to every one that Texas does, which that will add up. I'm not the world's biggest fan of warships with 2 guns total, which is what Texas has. I mean, you can get away with it somewhat if it's 2 guns in a twin turret, because you then at least have 2 guns firing at the same time. But Texas kind of has the single gun turret issue, and everything's en echelon, so the chances of you bringing more than one of those guns to bear in any direction is pretty limited.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that was really the United States' first kind of dip into the what you could call like the modern warship era, the modern steel hull warship area.
Yeah.
So they were basically kind of like prototypes.
Yeah, and the US had something of a gap. I mean, commonly there is a fairly valid issue to raise about the fact that, you know, some of the flaws in the Scharnhorst and Bismarck class battleships of World War II Germany can be traced back to the fact that there was this big gap in capital ship construction in Germany from the end of this First World War through to the mid 1930s. And to a certain extent, Maine and Texas represent the end of a similar period for the US Navy, because the US Navy had never been particularly large. There'd been an abortive attempt to expand it in the 1810s, thanks to the War of 1812, which had resulted in some rather interesting ships of the line, but those had almost gone immediately into reserve and mothballs because, you know, there wasn't a threat to fight anymore. And then you'd had this absolutely gargantuan expansion during the American Civil War. And
which
suddenly...
was mostly monitors.
Monitors. A lot of it was requisition ships, but towards the end, the monitors were getting considerably larger. You had USS New Ironsides, sort of decent-ish small ironclad, and a bunch of other warships also being constructed, more conventional ones. And so you had this massive navy, but then almost immediately after the conclusion of the Civil War, everything gets cut back, and it gets cut back so hard that there are even ships on the stocks in the process of construction where the funding is cut and they're not able to finish them. And the US Navy is forced to make do with absolutely tiny budgets, getting the odd ship, usually a small one here or there, for the better part of 20 years.
A lot of people might not know this, but after the Civil War, really up until basically the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. Navy was not the giant that it is today. No. I mean, there were nations in the Americas that had bigger navies than we did.
And this is what prompted Maine and Texas to be built. It was the Brazilian Navy, of all people, showed up in New York Harbor with their latest ironclad. And there was this very awkward moment of silence when people realized that that ironclad could probably take on and beat the entirety of the then existing US Navy. Which, you know, okay, fair enough. There are a ton of European navies that could do that as well. But the European navies were on the other side of the Atlantic and didn't particularly care about the US. Whereas the US obviously had interests in Central and South America. It had ideas of where its sphere of influence was. And for what was at that point, and to be honest, still is, the largest nation in South America to suddenly show up in their ports with a single naval unit that potentially gives them naval superiority and would mean that now the USA would be the one who's being ordered around in what they view as their own backyard. That had something of a galvanizing effect on Congress, and suddenly the US Navy was getting money to build ships again, except that because they'd had this gap, and it wasn't just a gap of experience, it was also the gap of technology, because as we've been saying, the late 19th century, the technology's been advancing massively. So you have a US Navy that's being asked to build new battleships on the cusp of the properly formal pre-dreadnought era starting, when, you know, the last big warship that they actually designed was back in the era of monitors and early broadside ironclads. So it's not exactly surprising that Maine and Texas were not exactly sort of one or the other when it came to what they were. They were, as you said, they're basically prototypes that allowed the US ship designers to figure out what would work and what wouldn't, and then they could move on within the scope of what was still a relatively limited budget to try and design something that was vaguely recognizable as an actual proper warship.
Right. And we have the great Teddy Roosevelt to thank for really the big expansion of the United States Navy in the early 20th century. He was a big proponent of the Navy, especially after the Spanish-American War.
Yes. Yeah. And to be honest, the US Navy was going through a number of tactical evolutions during this period as well, which is why you see ships like, say, USS Olympia, which on paper although it's a protected cruiser, it's not too far removed actually in terms of capabilities from USS Maine at the time.
For sure. And
Uh,
really quickly, can
yeah.
you kind of explain a little bit about what's the difference between a protected cruiser and an armored cruiser?
So this is two classes of ship that exist for 20, 30 years in the run up to and just into World War One. By World War One, the protected cruiser is being replaced by the what's called the light armored cruiser, which then kind of evolves into the heavy cruiser and the light cruiser in the interwar period. But for the period that we're talking about, the armored cruiser was usually large, usually fast, considerably heavily armed. A number of nations thought of them as effectively almost lightweight battleships, or at least ships that could stand in the line of battle, using the old Age of Sail terminology, even as a secondary unit. And you see this at things like the Battle of Tsushima, where both Japanese and Russian armored cruisers are there fighting in the line alongside their battleships. But they're not as heavily armed as battleships. They still have a belt armor, and some of the belt armor is actually quite substantial. So in some ways they are kind of scaled down battleships, if you like, just considerably scaled down, but it depends on exactly who's designing them. Whereas the protected cruiser doesn't have any belt armor protection at all. What they have is, for those people who play World of Warships will recognize, the discussion of a turtleback armor design, although the term turtleback armor actually goes all the way back to the late 19th century, when they which is when they're first talking about it. And what this is effectively a curved turtle shell like armored deck, and the idea is that this preserves the underwater integrity of the ship. So it protects the magazines, it protects the machinery, and that's it. And the main way it affords that protection is with this kind of sloping, relatively thin armor. A shell that punches through the side of the ship should, in theory, skip off of that armor. But it means that you can, although deck armor does weigh a fair bit when you start putting up to any substantial weight, because you're not having to put in belt armor as well, you can have a cruiser that's much lighter and therefore much faster and also much cheaper. But it's still got a degree of protection for the really important vital parts, because, to be perfectly honest, it doesn't matter too much if you shoot up the upper works of the ship, unless something really catches fire in a big way. That's not going to sink it. It's putting holes in the big chambers, like the engine spaces, that will send a ship to the bottom.
Sure. Yeah. And so USS Olympia, you were mentioning, she's a one of a kind protected cruiser from the Spanish American era. And you said she is not so much, her capabilities are not so different from an armored cruiser. Why do you think that is? Why was the Olympia? What makes her like the ship of legend that she kind of is?
Yeah, I mean, partly she was in the right place at the right time, because she got to take part in the Spanish-American War, and because of her size and capabilities, she was the flagship for the expeditionary force that was sent out to the Philippines. So, of course, she got front and center billing for that particular battle. So part of it is circumstance, but part of the reason for her being in that position in the first place and being able to be assigned as the flagship is that, to be honest, she's actually probably one of the few really capable cruisers that the US Navy has at that point. She's very heavily armed for a protected cruiser. She's quite large. Her displacement is almost the same as Maine. And her armament's actually distributed in a slightly saner manner. She has a couple of twin 8-inch gun turrets on the center line. She has a substantially larger secondary battery. She's a bit faster than Maine. Pretty much the only characteristic where Maine has any kind of advantage compared to her is, the 10-inch guns technically are slightly heavier than the 8-inch. And the armor, which on Olympia, because she's a very big protected cruiser, is just the deck, albeit a fairly substantial deck. And she's actually designed at a time when the US Navy is still very much thinking of itself as a second or third tier Navy. So they're looking at the potential warfare, obviously because she's being built pre-Spanish-American War, from a perspective of, if we fight anybody, we're either going to fight navies that are so small and trivial we can just sail up and blow them up, so that doesn't matter too much, or we're going to be fighting France, Britain, Russia, someone like that, someone with a navy we can't possibly hope to actually defeat in a straight up fight because we don't have the numbers. And so Olympia's design is to act as a long distance, long endurance commerce raider. So her purpose is to sail around and disrupt enemy commerce and trade. And for that, she needs to be fast, which she is for the time. She needs to be long range, which she is, again, for the time. And the reason for her extensive armament is because she has to be able to overpower any reasonable escort that, or anti-radar hunting ships that she might find while she's out at sea. So the US designers, they have to look at what are the capabilities of everybody else's protected cruisers, which are the ships that are almost certainly going to be used to try and protect merchant trade. And then we have to build something that's better than that. Because if we build something that's equal, it might win, it might lose a fight, we don't know. Sure. But, you know, even if it wins a fight, it's going to be reasonably damaged and therefore can't continue its mission. Whereas if we build it with enough firepower to overwhelm most other protected cruisers, then hopefully it can continue its mission, even if it has to take out 2 or 3 enemy ships in the course of that voyage. The Spanish-American War is actually kind of responsible for her not becoming a very common sight in the US Navy in terms of having many sister ships, because almost around about the same time that she's completed and shortly before the Spanish-American War, they're beginning to change their ideas about how they're going to fight from being very much the underdog and having a fleet of effectively raiders to actually maybe we can stand up for ourselves, at least in home waters. And for that, you need battleships, and to support the battleships, you need a fleet screen, and the fleet screen needs to be fairly substantial, which means you need a reasonably large number of cruisers. And unfortunately, for all of her, you know, benefits, Olympia is very large and very expensive, and they know they can't afford a fleet screen made up entirely of Olympia type cruisers, as cool as that might otherwise have been. And so this kind of very large protected cruiser, unfortunately, Olympia is the only real example of that in that time period for the US Navy, because they then go back to smaller cruisers that are more suitable for mass production in the fleet screen.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I know you've talked about making a trip to the United States to visit some of these historic sites. Now, Olympia is still a museum ship to this day. Are you planning on visiting Olympia?
Yes, definitely. It's a case of, I really do want to visit Olympia, and of course USS New Jersey is just across the way, so you see 2 for the price of 1 for going to Philadelphia.
Right across the Delaware River. Yeah, you can see them from each other. You can see New Jersey from Olympia and Olympia from New Jersey.
Exactly. So they are very definitely at the top of my priority list of things to see. Basically, at the moment, the one thing that's holding me back from being able to book that trip is the fact that almost a year and a half on, travel from the UK to the US is still effectively banned.
Yeah.
So, and I'm actually getting very nervous because originally it was supposed to be August, and then I thought, no, there's no point. We're not going to have everything sorted in time for August. So I thought, late September is probably okay, because the weather should still be all right. We won't be fully into winter, and hopefully by then, given, you know, this was my thinking a few months ago when the UK vaccination program was up and running and doing a pretty good job of itself, I thought, right, well, we'll have everybody, or the vast majority of the population, mostly sorted out for COVID wise by June, July, which, to be honest, we pretty much have. Sure. And then I thought, well, at that point, you know, even if they don't completely reopen travel to the US, they might at least reopen business travel if you've got all your medical stuff in order that you can show you're not a risk. and then I could book flights and hopefully see everything in September. But at the moment, it looks like there's absolutely no traction in that respect. So who knows? It might be a very close run thing. They might announce at the end of August, okay, we're reopening things. I might have to book some last minute expensive flights, or this restriction might drag on past the point of when I'm supposed to be there, which would be quite annoying.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, I'd love to see what videos you would make on those ships. I'd like to go visit them myself. To be honest, I'd like to visit all 4 of the IOS. Really.
Yeah, I mean that's another thing that's on my list of plans of things to do. But I suspect that's going to have to be multiple trips to the States.
Yeah,
because they are almost completely all over the place.
Yep, and then of course Missouri is in Hawaii, so that would be from the UK. That would definitely be an expedition.
Yeah, I'm currently working on, believe it or not, 3, possibly even 4 itineraries for various trips to the US. So if I'm able to pull off a trip this year, it's going to be a kind of a revised one that will effectively be the eastern half of the US. Sure. So kind of Alabama and eastwards of that, going up the East Coast. Then I've got another itinerary that is kind of it includes Canada, because you've got HMS CS Haida there and a couple of other ships, but also goes sort of effectively looks down the central part of the US and the South Coast, so Texas, that kind of area. And that's because for some reason, I don't know quite why, but you guys seem to have a love of hauling ships into the most implausible places. There's some American Civil War era stuff, and even some World War II era stuff, literally smack bang in the middle of a continent, about as far away from the sea as it's humanly possible to get. But it does mean, because of the sheer size of things, it's kind of that central corridor would have to be one. And then the third itinerary would be looking at the West Coast, because there you've got Iowa, you've got Midway, you've got at least 1 or 2 of the Liberty ships. There's a whole bunch of other museum ships up and down the West Coast. Yeah. And then the West Coast is the more logical place to launch from if I do want to go to Hawaii to see Missouri, Arizona, Pearl Harbor in general, and that kind of thing.
Right.
The only complication then is, how do I get home, because I'm on the other side of the planet.
Yeah, no.
And yeah, I'm for that. I'm probably looking at a transpolar flight back to London, because with the best will in the world, I looked at what if I sort of do a complete round the world tour at that point and just keep heading west and maybe hit Japan to see Mikasa or something before heading across the great Eurasian continent. And then I realized if I do that, that involves a flight flying over either Russia, China, or the Middle East, none of which fill me with great confidence, to be perfectly honest. So
I completely understand why.
Yeah, at that point I was like, no, I would rather fly over the frozen wastes of the Arctic, thank you very much.
yeah I can't say as I blame you there, but I do understand why you want to see Mikasa, the only remaining pre-dreadnought battleship in the world.
Yeah, well, what's left of her anyway.
Yeah, because they basically put her in like a parking lot.
Yeah, well, they concreted her in, and then, to be honest, an awful lot of the ship has been gutted and hollowed out in the intervening time, to the point where, in some ways, it's almost arguable she's not even necessarily a ship. She's more a shell that used to be a ship. They have made a lot of restoration efforts since, and externally she looks fine. But I mean, at one point she was mostly hollowed out for use as a dance hall, of all things. So, you if you went aboard, say the current USS Texas, for example, which to be honest is not that much younger than Mikasa. It's only about 20 years younger, if that. But that is still recognizably, both externally and internally, a ship. It's got the decks, it's got the machinery, etc. Whereas I think, Mikasa, I do want to see it, but I am fully cognizant of the fact that large parts of her interior just don't exist anymore.
Yeah, and I saw your video with the head of the USS Texas museum that you posted a couple of weeks ago, and that was
Yeah.
kind of a relief that they mentioned that she's in better condition than some people let them on. Like she wasn't going to fall apart when they're putting her in the dry dock, because that's a ship I'd like to see.
Yeah, and I mean, hopefully she's going to get into dry dock, get everything fixed and sorted, which will be good. But yeah, people sometimes forget just how long ago these things were. I mean, there's probably you can probably count the number of people in the world who were alive when Texas was built on two hands. She's almost 110.
In your you made a fantastic video about USS Texas, and one of the things that's fascinating in that is you mentioned when they were building it, they were using mules.
Yeah,
to haul stuff around.
Yeah, I mean, when Texas was originally ordered, human flight was kind of a nice gimmick that a couple of bicycle makers down in Ohio had managed to pull off, and everyone's like, "Oh yeah, that's cool." Well, I guess some rich people can, have fun flying around above the rest of us, and that's about it. It's like that's how far back in history we're talking about. And then you look at these days where people going to space. We have jets and I mean, one of the things that I always found quite amusing was the good old statistic of the length of the first human flight by the Wright brothers, powered human flight, from takeoff to landing was actually less than the length of a Boeing 747.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
And yet nowadays, well, not only can you just randomly get on a 747 as a generic person and fly to wherever you like at speeds that would have been unimaginable at the time when Texas was under construction, but even the 747 is almost out of service, being replaced with a newer generation of aircraft. Yep. So there is a huge time gap between where we stand now and places like World War I naval history. To be honest, even World War II naval history these days. And these things do degrade. They need maintenance. They need proper care and attention. I mean, it's a slightly interesting thought, I guess, from my perspective, in that when I was young, when I was in my teens, you could find and talk to World War I survivors. They weren't exactly common. They were a little bit thin on the ground, but you didn't have to go tremendously far. If you had a sort of between yourself and your family, if you had a social group that was maybe 30, 40 people strong of varying ages, you could usually find someone within that group who would know someone else at least who had fought in World War I, and you could go and talk to them. And so they might be getting on a bit, they might be in their 80s or 90s, but there was a reasonable number of them. There aren't any anymore. They're all gone. And World War II was not that far removed from World War I. World War I starts 1914. And then you've got, so for 14, you've got 24, 34, 44. So less than 30 years separates the start of World War I and World War II, which means that, now I'm in my early 30s. We're actually looking at a scenario where in maybe the next 10, 20 years, there won't be any World War II survivors either. And they're getting thin on the ground these days. I mean, there's, again, sort of back when I was in my teens, when you saw an older person and grey hair and such, you could reasonably reliably ask, "Oh, what did you do in the war?" And they'd be able to tell you, because that's the age bracket of people who'd been involved in World War II. These days, finding even World War II veterans is quite difficult, and that they're not going to be around for forever. I mean, I remember documentaries from the 90s and such, where they're like, well, here's one of the Doolittle Raiders talking about what they did. There aren't any anymore. Yeah. Everyone who flew on the Doolittle Raid is gone. You could talk to people from Midway. You could talk to people from the Hunt for the Bismarck, you could talk to all sorts of people back in the 90s, and most of the people from that period are already gone. So it just emphasizes it's a period of history that is fairly rapidly and unobtrusively slipping out of living memory.
Yeah,
which makes preserving what we can from those people's testimonies even more important, I think.
Yep. Yeah, 100% agree. And we're talking a bit about pre-dreadnoughts and dreadnoughts and things like that. For people who might not know, can you give just a brief explanation about the differences between pre-dreadnoughts and dreadnought battleships?
Yeah, so the pre-dreadnought, as we kind of mentioned earlier, you've got the Majestic class, which roughly speaking, most people agree is the start of the formal pre-dreadnought era. So before that, you've got ironclads of varying descriptions. The pre-dreadnought era is kind of settled by the general design concepts of the Majestic class. So you've almost all of them will have 4 main guns, usually 12-inch, sometimes 11-inch, sometimes 13-inch, or some sub-variant thereof in between, but of approximately that caliber. They're almost always distributed in a couple of twin turrets, one forward and one aft. They're capable of between 16 and 20 knots with an average of 18. They have armor that is face-hardened steel of some, whether it's Harvey or Corrupt steel, but it's still face-hardened steel. They're using vertical triple expansion engine propulsion, and they have secondary and tertiary batteries. The secondary batteries are more for use in battle with other capital ships. The tertiary and sometimes further batteries have uses against torpedo boats. And part of their whole design philosophy is that they've got these big guns, but these big guns are not going to be firing particularly often. And this is why they have this sort of large secondary battery. And the idea is that you'll use the big guns at close range to punch big holes in the vital parts of the ship, and they'll be the ship killers. But your secondary batteries, which can fire a lot faster and being more numerous as well, will put a lot more shells in the air. These are the things that are going to cripple your opponent, knock out their fire control, kill their command crew, set them on fire. And then once you've diminished their fighting capability, this is when you close in with your big guns and finish off the opponent. So that's your pre-dreadnought.
In the pre-dreadnought era, the secondary guns were usually a bit more accurate than the big guns. Is that correct?
They could be. I mean, at the start of, and for most of the pre-dreadnought era, everything was still pretty much being aimed by eye, and with some very maybe occasionally with some very simple range finding equipment. But yeah, usually the accuracy for those guns came in more from the fact that you'd probably miss your first salvos, but because they were relatively quick firing, once you could fire 2 or 3 salvos to establish the range, and then once you had the range, start firing fairly rapidly, and those subsequent shots would, a reasonable chunk of them would usually hit the target. Whereas with the big guns, they could fire and they'd effectively be doing the same thing, but because they're so much larger, their reload speed is so much slower that by the time they've reloaded, your secondary batteries might have fired 4 or 5 or 6 shots themselves. So they might already be on target or close to being on target when your big guns have still only got their second shot to go out. Sure. And then by the time they've got their third shot to go out, the entire situation in terms of distance and speed and everything might well have changed. So they're come back to square one, which doesn't help. But then towards the end of the pre-dreadnought era, you've got what they call director firing coming in, more advanced rangefinders coming in, fire control computers coming in, and so battle ranges start growing and growing and growing, and that starts to edge out the secondary batteries, because now the big guns can hit at a range that's either where it's very difficult for the small guns to hit, or in some cases even impossible for the small guns to hit. Plus, because they're much bigger and have much longer range capabilities, these big guns don't have to elevate as far. so you're not having to fire them almost mortar-like at the maximum extensions of range. And with heavier shells, they're retaining more energy over longer distances, so they actually retain the ability to penetrate the target and do considerable damage. And all of that agglomerates into the Dreadnought era, and that's the single biggest difference between Dreadnoughts and pre-Dreadnoughts is that on the Dreadnought, the main battery, which had kind of been almost, not quite, but almost a secondary function on the pre-Dreadnoughts, was now the big and the only talking point. So you had lots of big guns, all of the same caliber. The secondary battery was basically reduced to just being an anti-torpedo boat or anti-destroyer defense system. It was no longer there for engaging the other side's capital ships, and combat was now taking place at a much longer distance. And then that's the core of your Dreadnought philosophy. Everything else, armor, speed, numbers, etc., all of that grows out from the idea that we're now just using lots of big guns.
Sure. Yeah, excellent. So what's considered the first United States Dreadnought, USS South Carolina. The curator for the New Jersey Museum, he considers it a semi-dreadnought because it has the dreadnought armament, but it doesn't quite have the speed. It doesn't quite have the armor protection on it. Where do you fall in that? Do you agree with Mr. Szymanski, or do you consider it a full dreadnought?
I think from the perspective of where we are now, I would agree with him. I think the thing was back then you have something of an issue. I mean, specifically for the US Navy, Congress is still not giving them a lot of money. Congress is also imposing limits on how big a ship can be. So the US Navy is faced with trying to enter the Dreadnought era, but also having to do so on a budget and on a displacement limit.
Yeah, because the Congress had basically forced the Navy to build a dreadnought from pre-dreadnought. I mean,
you can actually see this if you look at pictures of Connecticut, USS Connecticut, the last pre-dreadnought class, and USS South Carolina. If you're not looking in detail, it's actually incredibly easy to get the two confused. Sort of a glance inspection, you have to actively be looking for the fact that South Carolina has twice as many main gun turrets. Otherwise, you can just accidentally swap the two over because they are effective. They are very similar designs. Now, the thing is, the reason why I say I agree with Ryan Szymanski's assessment of it from a kind of a post Dreadnought era perspective is because at the time, when you look at something like HMS Dreadnought, it's got the firepower. So to South Carolina, they both have 8-gun broadsides. They've got the armor. Both their armors are compatible with or similar to the immediately preceding pre-Dreadnoughts. The single biggest difference between the two is speed. And that with Dreadnought can hit 21 knots, which ends up becoming kind of the standard for a lot of Dreadnought battleships. Whereas South Carolina is still stuck at around 18 knots because they've given her vertical triple expansion engines, the same as the previous Connecticut's. And as we said, they didn't have as much space to put as much power either. Now, at that point, 1906, 1907, maybe up to 1909-ish, that's not as much of a problem as you might think, because the vast majority of everybody's fleets are still made up of pre-dreadnoughts.
Sure.
So the fact that your dreadnought can only go as fast as the rest of your fleet is not actually that big a deal, because otherwise, you'd have like 2 or 3 ships just racing ahead on their own, and that's a recipe for disaster. But it's once you cross over sort of the 1909-1910 threshold and dreadnoughts start to become a lot more common and pre-dreadnoughts are being relegated to second line roles, that's where, and you can actually see this with the way the US Navy operates the South Carolinas as well. This is kind of when some of the issues with this lower speed start to become apparent. And then you hit at the outbreak of World War I, 1914, 1915, and that's when even the big navies, or at least the Royal Navy, ditches pre-dreadnoughts entirely from their main battle line. And the US Navy does almost the same thing. They detach the South Carolinas from the main battle line or the main battle divisions, and they start using them in support of the pre-dreadnoughts rather than in support of the later dreadnoughts like the Delawares, the Wyomings, and the Floridas and Nevadas, etc., that are coming down the line.
Sure.
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the Germans still keep a squadron of pre-dreadnoughts in the High Seas Fleet, as we know, at Jutland. But even then, even Scheer doesn't want them there. He has to be persuaded to have them there by the admiral in command of them. So by the time you're solidly locked into World War One, at that point the South Carolinas have kind of dropped off the radar a bit in terms of being modern battleships, and they are at that point they have become semi-dreadnoughts, I would say.
Sure. There was a very famous legendary naval officer who served as the executive officer on South Carolina, and that would have been.
Go on then.
That would have been Chester Nimitz.
Yes.
Served as the executive officer on the South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And you did a another great video on Admiral Ernest King.
Yes.
You titled it Semper Iratus.
Iratus,
always angry. Is that?
Yeah.
Because of his legendary short temper.
Mm-hmm.
And both he, Admiral Ernest King, and Chester Nimitz, of course, were big in World War II, but they were also veterans of the Spanish-American War. So
yes,
they had a lot of experience.
Yeah, and it's one of these things that sometimes people don't realize when it comes to this kind of thing. The top end high command for the US Navy in World War II, they are people who have graduated out of Annapolis at the very turn of the 20th century. So they were already in various positions within the US Navy, albeit lower ranking positions during World War One. They've, as you say, they've got a lot of experience, but this is one of the things that perhaps accounts for the fact that some of the US Navy's performances in the starting part of the US involvement in World War II in 1942 are perhaps less than stellar, shall we say?
Sure.
Because all of these officers, I mean, and even the lower ranking admirals, they're still class of 1910, the 1910s. Maybe a few of them are the class of the early 1920s. But they've all been brought up, educated in a world of pre-dreadnoughts and early dreadnoughts. Aircraft are not a thing as a threat at the time that they're going through their initial formative years in the US Navy. Submarines are barely a thing. They're just about becoming cognizant of them as a threat. And, anti-aircraft guns, what are those? Let alone anything like radar or night vision technology. And so by the time you get to World War II, I think you effectively have almost two classes of US Navy officer. You have the US Navy officers who allowed their opinions and their strategies to largely be formed in this 1910s, 1900s, 1910s time period and didn't really ever leave it. And they're the ones who end up doing things like, sailing in a perfectly straight line, and I guess a counterpoint to a line of enemy destroyers, and then acting very surprised when they get torpedoed. And then, fortunately for the Royal Navy, you also or the US Navy, sorry, and I suppose for the Royal Navy because you're allied with us, you have people like Nimitz and King, and a few others as well, who they come up through the ranks. They've had that same formative experience, but they allow themselves to adapt a lot more to circumstances and technologies as they go. And as I said in the video on Admiral King, you know, for all the fact that yes, he was not the world's greatest fan of the British, he was also one of about 3 out of 3 carrier admirals, if you like, out of a US Navy that at the time was made up of about 50 or 60 admirals, most of whom thought that battleships were the way forward. And obviously, those opinions changed over World War II, but it was probably fortunate for everyone involved that King, despite being an Annapolis graduate from the early 1900s, was fully cognizant and au fait with how aircraft carriers worked and what they could be used for, and was willing to back other carrier admirals like Fletcher and Mitscher to the hilt when it came to, and even Halsey, when it came to pushing them out into action against the Japanese. And obviously Nimitz, acting as his subordinate, did a similarly excellent job.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've mentioned a couple different types of warships. Do you have a favorite type of warship?
Oh, that's a difficult one. See,
it is.
Yeah, I mean,
and I would accept a couple different answers too.
Yeah, see, the thing is that I mean, of all of them, or I'd say of the 4 major surface warship types that you have in World War I and mostly World War II, so destroyer, cruiser, battleship, carrier, I would say probably my least favorite personally is actually the aircraft carrier. Not because they're not good, they are definitely good ships, but because if you were to send me back in time and say you can be in command of this, to be perfectly honest, being in command of a carrier of those 4 major ship types is probably the least exciting, because you're going to be sitting back, you're going to be launching aircraft. The most danger you can expect is enemy air attack, at which point you don't really have much choice but dodge, weave, and hope your anti-aircraft gunners are up to scratch. And that's it. It's like if you're going to end up in any other situation like submarine attack or heaven forbid surface attack, something's gone horribly wrong and there's probably not an awful lot you can do about it. Sure. So for me, that they're the least interesting if you're going to have me time travel back to command them. Whereas battleships, you know, you've got the allure of the big guns, the heavy armor, they're the centerpiece, they fight the big battles. But then equally, you know, cruisers are running around doing anything and everything all over the place. So whilst a battleship might fight a really big major action with another enemy battleship, you're far more likely to see action aboard a cruiser, because a cruiser is going to fight many smaller engagements, and they're still, at least for the big 10,000-tonner treaty era ones, pretty big and impressive ships, and still fairly useful even in those larger engagements. And then you have the destroyers, and the destroyers are kind of like there where you have the most freedom of operation. Obviously, you can't just do whatever you want, but your orders are going to, and remit is going to be the widest. You can go charging around after enemy targets. You've got torpedoes, so if you do come across something particularly large, you've got a chance of hurting them. And it's a lot more of a life on the edge, because the flip side is you have no armor. So if you run into something big and they get the drop on you, you are a little stuffed. So each of those other classes has their allure to me. I think if you put a gun to my head and said you must go back and be and command a ship or a ship from a given type in World War II, I'd probably go for the cruiser, because the cruiser to me it has a balance of some of the independent action of a destroyer commander, with also getting to see a fair bit of action and being able to hold your own in most circumstances, but combined with the fact that if push comes to shove, you probably have at least some protection to hide behind once the explosives start falling.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. It's a very respectable answer. So yeah, say you were a captain of a cruiser, maybe like a heavy cruiser or something like that.
Yeah.
You did another like super interesting video on warship mascots, and my girlfriend actually particularly enjoyed that. She loved seeing the cats on the battleships and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Would you have a mascot, and what would it be? What would your cruiser mascot be?
Now you see that's I think again this is a matter of two answers, because from a practical side, and you definitely do have to have an animal mascot. I think if you've got a large ship, I think from a practical side, I'd probably actually go for a dog of some description. They're slightly less, believe it or not, as far as I can tell, they're slightly less likely to randomly catapult themselves into the ocean than cats are. There's a disturbing number of ship's cats that appear to have just been walking along the deck one day, taken fright to something, and completely forgotten that, in fact, the ship ends 3 feet to their left.
Oh, no.
Which is a bit of a shame, considering that cats generally don't like water.
Yeah.
So, and also, ships mascots they evolve out of an era when they actually had a very practical purpose, keeping the ship free of vermin. And as so I can't remember who it was who pointed out, but basically, if you have mice, you want a cat. If you have rats, you need a dog. Because a cat can take a rat, but one, it's not going to be taking that many rats, and two, when you're talking about something the size of a ship, you can get some fairly disturbingly powerful rats. But even the biggest rat you're plausibly likely to come across on a warship is not going to be much of a match for something like a terrier or a hound that is going to completely overwhelm it. So yeah, I think from a practical perspective, the general ship's mascot would probably have to be a dog of some description. But the captain can, of course, also have a pet if he wants to, because he is the ultimate authority aboard the ship. And I think if I was going to do, if my personal ship's mascot would probably be some form of pet bird.
Hey, that's a good choice. Also, it's
Yeah,
a very
probably,
classic pirate.
yeah,
Pirate
probably a cockatiel, because they're hilarious.
Yeah, you can teach them to sing your ship song or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, you could teach them to whistle the ship's song. You can just about teach them to speak as well, to a small degree. Not quite as much as a parrot, but also, they're slightly smaller birds, so that they can exist within a ship without going completely stir crazy. And also the other advantage when it comes to any kind of bird that you're going to keep as a pet, they can give you a nip, but that's about it. Whereas if you're going to be a classic pirate, I always do wonder with pirates, it's like when they have 3 missing fingers and a missing eye, it's sort of, did you lose those in combat, or did you just annoy your parrot one too many times?
Yes. So you probably would not have a bear like a Battleship Texas, or some kind of venomous snake like in the Voyage of the Damned.
Yeah, I would prefer to avoid those circumstances. Yeah, you've got enough things to worry about running a warship without having to worry if your mascot is going to try and eat, poison, or swat anybody.
Yes, that is a good kind of way to think about your mascot. I think. Do you have a favorite type of dreadnought battleship? Because you mentioned what your favorite pre-dreadnought was.
Yeah, I have a few actually, and exactly which one is my favorite kind of depends a lot on the time and the day in question. Now, obviously, I absolutely love HMS Warspite. That goes without saying, and I actually like the Queen Elizabeth class as a concept as a whole generally. But I also do have, in terms of dreadnought capital ships, I also have a quite significant soft spot for HMS Renown in her refitted configuration. Not only because of what she did, but also because of her look. She's a really, really nice ship.
Sure.
But I'm also somewhat partial to the Derflinger class of battle cruisers of the Imperial German Navy. They I think of all the ships, dreadnoughts class type ships that are on my rotating list of favorites, they're the ones that appeal to me the most on just an engineering level rather than anything else. But I also have a major soft spot for the New Mexico class. And I can't quite put my finger on it because, they're part of the standard class.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, well, why them particularly? And, it is difficult for me sometimes to put my finger on it, but to me, they just seem to epitomize the standard class in a way that none of the others do. They've just got this balance of size and appearance and layout that just seems just that little bit better, because you've got the Nevadas, and the Nevadas, you look at them, at least when you know anything about the standards, you go, right, they're the first standards, but they've got 2 less guns. You can see both with them and actually with the Pennsylvanias as well that they are still outgrowths of what I term the first generation Super Dreadnought design period. So they've kind of got vertical bows. They just look that little bit older. You can, but if you put a Pennsylvania, a Nevada, and the USS Texas up against each other, you can see that they are very closely related design wise. Whereas once you get into the New Mexicos and the Tennessees and the Colorados, now you're starting to see a more angled bow. They're just that little bit larger. The aesthetic has changed a bit for the better, I think. But when it comes to them, whilst the Colorados do have a certain amount of appeal.
Yeah, see, that was what I would have picked for the standard types.
Yeah, the thing is, they are the most powerful, obviously, with the 16-inch guns. But because they are, again, outgrowths of the standard type, with those twin 16-inch guns, they look a little bit, and much as I hate to say this, over-armed. They look like the hull looks a little bit too small, especially in the 1920s photos you see. They look like the hull's just a fraction too small for the guns they're carrying. It's a subtle thing, and if you like ships just carrying big guns, then that's almost a complete turnaround in that'll be a positive. But for me, the Colorados, they're just begging for maybe another 20 feet of hull length.
Sure.
The Tennessees, as you may well know, having obviously watched my videos, the Tennessees were originally designed to have twin 16s as well as the Colorados. They weren't allowed to. They ended up with the triple 14s. But I think with the Tennessees, it does show, Tennessee and California, you can kind of, they're almost got a slight, they've got an inversion of the slight issue I have with the Colorados, in that they look like they should have something different in their main guns. And I don't know how much of that is my knowledge of their background influencing how I look at them, but I do kind of see that in them myself. Whereas with the New Mexicos, as I say, you've got the late form standard hull form, which looks quite nice, and it just fits. To me, the New Mexicos, they're almost like a tailored suit, if you see what I mean. They fit their aesthetic, they fit their armament, they fit everything really well, and so they're kind of my favorite of the standards and one of my favorite dreadnought designs overall.
Sure. I of course have to go with the Iowa class as well, because it's kind of the pinnacle of United States battleships.
Yes. Yeah.
That's kind of a cliche choice, I guess.
I mean, they are good-looking ships. Again, I think my perspective as an engineer and a historian does color a lot of the way I look at certain ships.
Sure.
Because I look at the Iowas and I think, yeah, they look nice, they look powerful, and then my mind immediately is drawn to that really long, very thin, pointed bow, and going, oh yeah, but that's awful seakeeping in anything but a calm sea, which kind of knocks them down a few points. Right. Mentally, even if aesthetically it doesn't actually change anything. And to be honest, it's the same thing actually when you talk about the pinnacle of battleship design with the Royal Navy, with Vanguard. A lot of people like Vanguard, and yeah, Vanguard's not a bad looking ship, and she's a very good ship engineering wise. But sometimes people look at it and say, oh well, isn't Vanguard kind of like almost a modern Hood, a modernized Hood? So if you like Hood, shouldn't you like Vanguard? But then I look at Vanguard and go, yeah, but she's just a bit too busy and cluttered amidships.
Yeah.
Vanguard's bow into the forward superstructure, great. Stern, great. The amidships is just a mess. So it's kind of again, it knocks it down. Even though obviously Hood is a less capable vessel than Vanguard, Hood to me looks better than Vanguard, and a refitted Hood would probably still look better than Vanguard. But again.
Yeah, I was going to bring up HMS Hood because I think that's a beautiful looking ship. She's very elegant looking, but
yes.
With your engineering background, kind of why you might not necessarily put it.
She is a very good looking ship. I think everyone agrees Hood was a very good looking ship. I think for me, again, it's probably the engineering factor of knowing just how wet she was aft with that low quarterdeck.
Right.
And then when you look at something like the Renown and Repulse, which are of a similar era and of a similar design stance, but didn't quite have the same issues, it's kind of Hood's definitely there. Like if you ask me to put a top 10 list of favorite Dreadnought capital ships together, Hood would definitely be on there. But she can't break into the top 5 just because of those issues. Whereas when you look at some of the others that I mentioned as my favorites, they don't have those minor issues that mitigate slightly against them. I think if Hood had HMS Renown style refit the way she was planned to, then, and as you've probably seen from the artwork that was done for me for that potential refit, there she looks really good. If that refit had gone ahead, or a similar one to it, she'd definitely be in the top 5 quite easily. But
for sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Robert Williams in the chat, he wants to ask you, what do you think about Warspite?
Well, as I said earlier, Warspite is one of my probably top 3 favorite warships of all time. The Queen Elizabeth design concept itself is really good, so I appreciate it from an engineering perspective. Perhaps even more so when in the last year or two I've learned about a bunch of conversations that Admiral Jellicoe had with the Director of Naval Construction, where he wanted to actually introduce small tube boilers into the Royal Navy's capital ship fleet several years in advance of when they historically did. And their calculations showed that whereas in practice the Queen Elizabeths couldn't quite make their designed 25 knot top speed, if they'd had small tube boilers, they probably would have smashed through 27, 28 knots quite comfortably, which would have basically made them fast battleships 20 years ahead of their time. So that makes me appreciate their design capability even more. And then you've got Warspite herself, what she accomplished at the Battle of Jutland, what she accomplished in World War II, and the fact that she got this refit in the interwar period that made her look even better than she did originally. She is kind of the quintessential classic warship to me in terms of a battleship. She's got so many notable actions under her belt, and to be honest, although she did get fairly badly beaten up towards the end of the war with things like Fritz X bombs and everything, in some ways, and this may just be the British person in me talking, but it makes me love her even more.
Sure.
Because she keeps getting these hits in the latter part of World War II from various things, and she just will not die. She just keeps coming back again just to shoot some more Germans.
Definitely, yeah. Not exactly the same, but it's a similar thing with USS Nevada, where she's hitting Pearl Harbor, and she comes back from that, and she survives the Normandy invasion, and then she survives a nuclear test blast.
And those kind of sort of almost back from almost the grave elements do appeal to me greatly. I mean, that's why one of the battles I've not covered, and for good reason, is the Battle of Surigao Strait, as part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, because that is effectively, it's the revenge of Pearl Harbor.
Sure.
because the majority of those battleships had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, and now they're back and dishing out the damage to the Japanese. And I want to make sure that that battle gets a fairly special treatment, because it just, I don't know what it is, but there is just a certain additional allure to that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the stuff the guys went through, your videos on the salvage efforts in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, super interesting how they brought all but 2 of the battleships back.
Yeah.
It's Oklahoma and Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that when I was looking at what should I do as a kind of my long-term video project, because I started working on those video scripts a long while before they were actually released, and I thought, well, you know, people keep saying to me, oh, you should cover Pearl Harbor, you should cover Pearl Harbor, you should cover Pearl Harbor, and maybe someday I will cover Pearl Harbor, but you know, there are probably half a dozen good videos on YouTube covering the December the 7th attacks on Pearl Harbor.
Sure.
And there's probably 4 or 5 dozen others that aren't so good. But you know, it's a subject that has been covered quite extensively. And I thought, well, yeah, I could do it, and I say I will eventually do it. But that is very much just putting another retelling into the mix. Right. It's a story that most people have heard. Maybe I can bring something new to it, but it'll be minor new additional things. Whereas for the salvage efforts, good luck finding anything extensive on those. I mean, despite the fact it was a major multi-year effort that returns all these ships to service, you know, even when I started doing the research for it, finding people who'd written books about it, you know, you could buy all the books that have sold a reasonable number of copies about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and you could build a small house out of them. Whereas the number of books that have been written on what happened in the salvage efforts, you wouldn't even fill a shelf. So I thought it was I thought it's a subject that deserves to be covered. The people who obviously pulled it off deserve to be remembered for what they did, and
absolutely
it wasn't anywhere close. It's not been covered anywhere near as close to what it deserves to be, in my opinion. So that's why I went and did those.
Yeah, that was very well done. Very well done. Let's see. You're talking a little bit about documentaries and things like that. What about like warship movies? It's not a genre that's done a whole lot. Do you have any other scenarios or battles or things like that you think might make cool movies that they could make if they did it, you know, reasonably accurate?
Yeah, there's loads. I think the problem is that I think Hollywood has 2 problems with naval movies. One of which is that if you're going to tell the story of a big naval battle, that's going to be expensive, because you know, back in the day, when they're using a lot of practical effects, if you wanted to do aerial combat movies like Battle of Britain or whatever, or Red Tails, you could actually just go out and get 2, 3, 4 dozen aircraft and fly them around. And these days you can still get 3 or 4 aircraft and CGI composite in the rest, and it's at a distance sufficient that nobody particularly cares. And there's obviously been a lot of work that's gone into aerial combat games, which you can then use to create the digital pathing, etc., for those aircraft.
Sure.
On the ground, you know, there's a lot of tanks, there's a lot of APCs, there's a lot of artillery that's still around, and a fair amount of it that's still running, which again you can hire, you can use for ground battles. Plenty of reenactors and uniforms, replica and deactivated weapons and things like that you can use, and where you have to recreate something from scratch because maybe it doesn't exist or there's not a running version of it, you can do that. It's not a tremendous ask because, you know, even a tank is only so large. But then you get into the realms of naval combat, and ships are just on another scale entirely.
Yeah.
And then you get to Okay, it's like, oh, we're going to have a big battle, right? You want how many ships? It's sort of like what was it? I think Return of the Jedi had the record for the largest number of individual ships on screen for a very long time. And then I think one episode of Babylon 5 eventually pipped that to the post, but that took like 15, 20 years for them to get past it. Nowadays, obviously, with Mon-CGI, you can just spam ships all over the place.
Yeah, Babylon 5 was actually CGI.
Yeah, one of the first kind of all CGI things going on. But so back then, it's like putting that many ships on screen was a big achievement. These days, everyone and their dog using CGI can put 100 ships on screen or whatever. But when it comes to naval combat, unlike space combat, you've got to deal with the ocean as well. The ocean effects, making all that look realistic. And, you can't just CGI up an entire ship for your main characters to be on. You need interior shots, you need even exterior shots. So you're going to either have to use museum ships, or you're going to have to construct either full scale or near full scale replicas, at least static ones, kind of like they did for the Yamato movie and so forth. And all of this takes time, it takes expertise, and it involves a lot of expense that
definitely
the ground and air movies just don't tend to involve. I was actually watching Pirates of the Caribbean 3 of all films again a few days ago, and it reminded me one of the greatest missed opportunities from my perspective in that movie is at the end when you have the pirate fleet and the East India Company fleet facing off. It would have been absolutely awesome, both from a movie perspective and for me as a naval person, to see those two fleets go fully toe-to-toe at it, sort of Battle of Trafalgar style. But it's fairly obvious they have this big spectacular Black Pearl versus Flying Dutchman sequence, and then the hilariously terrible Black Pearl and Flying Dutchman versus Endeavour bit right at the end. But it's pretty obvious that's where they dumped most of their CGI budget.
Yeah.
And, if a film the size and scope of Pirates of the Caribbean 3 can't find the extra however many $1 million it would cost to do that full-scale fleet action, then I think that's one of the biggest reasons why you don't see too many of them done in Hollywood. Sure. And I mean, like, even with the recent Midway movie, maybe it's laziness, maybe it's budget, maybe it's both. But you see that even with the recent Midway movie, where the entire Japanese fleet, apart from the carriers, is made up of 4 classes of ship, 2 of which are completely fictional and made up, and the entire US Navy is apparently made up of 3 ships. It's like the Pearl. Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor movie, for all its faults, up to and including blowing up a bunch of Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates who apparently time traveled. So it's like, that's why we know that's what happened. We know Final Countdown, it would never have worked because Pearl Harbor clearly shows us a modern ship that teleports back in time just gets blown up by Japanese aircraft anyway. But even that, the actual parts that show the historical sequences are better than the most recent Midway movie, because they, for some reason, they chose to include the Pearl Harbor attack, but they decided absolutely everything was a Pennsylvania class battleship. Whereas at least, if you freeze frame elements of the Michael Bay Pearl Harbor, you can actually see someone went to the effort of, this is a Colorado class, this is a Pennsylvania class, that's a Nevada class. They actually had them all separate and in the correct positions. Whereas, Midway is like, everything's a Pennsylvania class, including our fleet oiler, also our Arizona, 3 different ways, none of it which are actually accurate to what happened.
Yeah, I think that was a big reason why they used all the Pennsylvanias, because of the Arizona.
Yeah, but I mean, this is one of the things that actually, as we've established, I'm not American, but one of the things that annoyed me the most out of that entire Midway movie was that sequence, that Pearl Harbor sequence, specifically because they did not do justice to either Arizona or Oklahoma, the 2 ships that had the biggest loss of life. Yeah. They kind of mashed them together So you, as I say, you have this weird thing where Arizona sinks 3 times in 3 separate ways. None of the 3 are being actually even close to how it actually died. Whereas for all its other faults, at least Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor showed what actually happened to Arizona, which like that's at least a basic courtesy to the men who died on Arizona, is show how they died semi-accurately, as opposed to, Arizona in Midway randomly keels over and rolls onto its side, which is actually what Oklahoma did, then magically refloats itself to sink sort of stern first, then magically refloats itself to blow up. It's just a mess. So that's the CGI, that's the CGI side of things. But I think the other big problem that Hollywood has, and which probably is part of the reason why they did things like U-571 back in the day, is Hollywood seems to believe that they can't sell a war movie that doesn't involve Americans.
Yeah, that's the Hollywood mentality. Yep.
Yeah, and unfortunately for that, there are only really 2 major conflicts. Well, there's three conflicts, 2 of which are major conflicts, where the US Navy has any kind of substantial action presence. And the way, not to get involved in politics or anything, but the way things are in Hollywood at the moment, I can't really see them doing a Spanish-American war movie.
Nope.
It's like, yeah, let's go and take over other people's colonies. That'll go down well in today's environment. And for similar reasons, I really can't see them doing an American Civil War era movie at any point in the near future either. Which basically means the only major naval conflict where the US Navy has any significant part to play is World War II.
Right.
And we've done Pearl Harbor, we've done Midway, both several times. All you've got left really is Coral Sea, which they probably wouldn't want to show because it would involve, more American carriers blowing up and being sunk than Japanese. And then things like the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which even for Hollywood is a little bit lopsidedly one-sided. The only one that I really don't understand why they haven't done is the Battle of Samar, because the Battle of Samar has everything. It's got the US Navy. It's got the US Navy being horrifically outnumbered and outgunned by the Japanese center force. So it's got the sort of the plucky underdog side of things. The actual history doesn't need any embellishing, like with USS Johnston and Samuel B. Roberts and everything. Like you can't write a plausible script where ships act in a more heroic manner. You've got the valiant last stand. You've got the fact of the success. You've got the cavalry coming in, if you like, at the last minute, and the enemy retreating in defeat. You've got everything that you could possibly want for a Hollywood naval movie, and somehow, for some reason, we've had like three tellings of Midway and 6 tellings of Pearl Harbor, and nothing about Samar, which I think is a great injustice. But because of that sort of underlying issue, if they want to make sure it involves Americans, that's why I don't think we're going to see a Jutland movie or a Trafalgar movie anytime soon. I know they did they've done some Trafalgar ones back in the day, but a modern Trafalgar movie, a modern Jutland movie, a modern Battle of Lissa movie,
a modern Hunt for the Bismarck movie could be awesome.
Yeah, all of those things would be fantastic movies to do. But I don't think they're going to get made because they can't find some way of involving lots of Americans in them. Unless you get Tom Hanks involved. Tom Hanks seems to be like a one-man naval movie making machine in Hollywood.
Right. Yeah, they would have to get like Christopher Nolan or somebody to do it.
Yeah. Or what's his name? I've forgotten his name now. I'll remember it in a minute.
Although we did have 1917, which was a fantastic movie.
Yes. Yeah. Although again, this is the thing. It's like 1917 is a really good movie, but it didn't have the kind of publicity and kind of top billing that Midway did.
No. I didn't.
So it had to stand far more on its own strengths than Midway Midway could.
Yeah, I didn't. Okay, so in a fantasy setting,
Mhm.
Drakkenfell is like a big director producer, and they would drop a big pile of money in front of you, and they say, Drakkenfell, we want you to make a naval movie, and you could do whatever you want. You could do some kind of fictional thing or a historical thing. What do you think you might do? Would you do a historical movie, or would you rather do like your own kind of fantasy thing? Because I had this idea that might be cool is if there was like some kind of like alternate, not necessarily alternate timeline, but like a parallel world type thing where it's like a world that never invented flight, and it has like steampunk battleships and stuff like that, and maybe the oceans are like 2.5 times the size. So you could have like these huge engagements and stuff like that. I always thought that might be a cool idea.
Yeah, I mean, I do have my own steampunk universe story series, which I'd really love to set into probably a series of movies or one of these sort of 10, 12 episode mini series. The expensive mini series type things where each episode's an hour or something like that. But I think if I was given my one shot of, here, you can be a director, we're going to give you effectively a blank check, make a movie. I think it would probably be a coin toss between a 3-way coin toss between Trafalgar, Jutland, and Samar.
Sure.
As to which one I went for.
Sure. And your own idea. I might talk to you a bit off off the stream a bit about something, because I might have an idea, kind of an idea about that. But we had a question from Robert Williams in the chat. Again, going back to what we were talking about previously about Pearl Harbor, and he says, given that the repaired ships from Pearl Harbor started to come back online in 1942, but stayed on the West Coast, doesn't it stand to reason Pearl Harbor had little impact on how the U.S. fought Japan? What are your thoughts on that?
So can you go over that question again?
Yes. Given that the repaired ships from Pearl Harbor started to come back online in 1942, but stayed on the West Coast, doesn't it stand to reason Pearl Harbor had little impact on how the U.S. fought Japan?
Yes and no. Part of the reason that the U.S. battleships were kept back on the West Coast, part of it was, they didn't have enough fast fleet oilers to support the overall fleet. That was a serious problem. But part of it was also the attacks on Pearl Harbor had made a lot of people very nervous that the Japanese were coming for the West Coast next. Now, obviously, we know, and to be honest, the US Navy was also pretty confident that the Japanese couldn't actually do that in any substantial numbers. But, what is military reality and what the general populace, especially with the press fanning the flames, thinks is going to happen are two very different things. And as a result, a lot of the other aspect of, apart from the fuel issues, was that it meant that the US Navy had to keep something big and visible on the West Coast to kind of say to people, yes, we're protecting you. Look, here's what your tax dollars have been spent on. And the older battleships, it was kind of a perfect storm. It said, well, we can't send them further west anyway. And they look big and impressive. And it means that we can then send, the North Carolina, the Washington, the South Dakota, and all the carriers. We can send those west, and all the cruisers, because no one's looking for them, because they're looking at these big, heavily gunned warships sailing up and down the coast, making them feel safe.
Sure.
But part of that is also the circumstances of the whole Japanese advance. So Pearl Harbor comes in, it hits the US Navy quite hard. The US Navy is not really then able to respond to all that much immediately. And during that time, the Japanese overrun the Philippines. They overrun a whole bunch of places in the Western Pacific. Now, the US wasn't planning in 1941 to reinforce the Philippines and fight it out from there, although that had been their war plan for a good chunk of the interwar period. But what that meant was that most of the infrastructure for the US to fight a Pacific War was still set up with that view in mind. So if Pearl Harbor hadn't happened and the Japanese had formally declared war without attacking the US Pacific Fleet, and then the Japanese said, right, we're going to declare war on you, and then everyone says, oh yeah, well look, the Japanese fleet is sailing for the Philippines, that gives the Philippines a little bit more time to prepare. If they're prepared, then they probably won't fall quite as quickly as they do. And at that point, regardless of whether or not the US Navy's plans involved a kind of a form of the island hopping campaign we did historically see, I have a feeling the political pressure at that point would have forced the USN to deploy a significant force of some description to the Philippines to try and stand off the Japanese assault. And if they've got their battleship fleet intact, you're going to have a lot of people going, well, we paid all this money for all these big battleships. They're all sitting there in Pearl Harbor. They're the most numerous heavy surface combatants we've got. Why don't you send them? And I mean, even with King and Nimitz around, and to be honest, you wouldn't have King and Nimitz around because King and Nimitz were brought in because of Pearl Harbor. So you would have had Admiral Kimmel. You would have had still the split commands between the Secretary of the Navy and the Chief of Naval Operations. So the US Navy wouldn't have had those very capable officers in those precise places, and the more dissolute command that it would have been less able to resist political pressure, at which point you probably would have seen some or all of the Pearl Harbor ships sent to the Philippines, either to base themselves there, to wait for an incoming Japanese attack, or to fight off a Japanese attack and kind of cut them off at the knees there, which probably would not have gone well. But it's one of these things of kind of, everyone can point to the updated US plans and say, yes, the US wasn't going to go to the Philippines. They would have stayed behind and done their island hopping, etc. It's like, yeah, that's what the plans say. And to a certain extent, that is actually how it worked out. But sure, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Look at the German plans for how to fight the British, or the British plans on how to fight the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, or the Russian plans on fighting the Germans, or indeed the Japanese plans on fighting the Americans. Yeah. Nobody's plans went the way they were hoping they were going to be.
Exactly. Yeah, that's pretty much a historical axiom there. I kind of have a personal request, of course. Mm-hmm. Of course, you definitely don't have to do it or whatever, but I would love to see a video that you do on the evolution from ironclads to pre-dreadnoughts, unless you find it's not really an interesting tale. But I think it would be fascinating to see the evolution between those types of ships.
Yeah, it is something I do have on the list of things to do. Nice. I actually have an absolutely colossal script already there for it. It's not nowhere near complete, but sure, we do have it. But the thing is, it's never going to be able to be one video. I've I've got up to that point.
Yep.
But there's no way I can do Ironclad to pre-Dreadnought in a single video. It's going to have to be multiple videos. And the biggest problem is the way everything overlaps, because if I do it, and this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to do, because if I do a video that is, say, broadside and central battery ironclads, which is probably a fairly neat box to put things in, because then you can move on to the turret-based ironclads, and then you can move on to the pre-dreadnoughts. And that works. I think that would work relatively well as a series of 3 videos.
Yep.
But that completely ignores all the monitors and everything in the American Civil War. And they come in pretty much around the same time as the first ironclad broadside ironclads are coming in. They're right at the beginning of the ironclad era. So if I do broadside ironclads and central battery ironclads, that'll take you from 1860 to, broadly speaking, although there's overlap with the turret based ones, take you up to sort of late 1870s. If I launch that video, people will be going, and what about the American monitors? Why aren't you talking about the American monitors?
Yeah, we're talking about like nearly half a century of history.
Yeah.
So
I have a feeling what I'm going to have to do is I'll line up that series, but and have to split the script accordingly. But I'm also going to have to separately split off an entire video about the development of American monitors. Which is obviously part of the ironclad development story, but within that, you've also got to further split things down, because you've got the coastal dash notionally oceanic monitors, which is sort of the stuff most people think about, and then you've got the riverine monitors that were fighting in the Civil War. They are different enough. I think they need their own video, because they'd be very difficult to fit into the. So that at that point, that kind of time period has already got 5 different videos, 2 of which are running parallel to the other 3. So it's going to be a bit of a difficult one to run, but I absolutely do want to do those, especially because there's an absolutely hilarious monitor, or, well, ironclad, maybe. I don't even know what it is. But I found a few photos of it, and I desperately want to talk about that thing in terms of how it developed, because it is possibly one of the craziest warships I've ever seen. So it's a river-based Union vessel, and I won't spoil it too much, but it basically looks like the unholy spawn of a second-rate wooden ship of the line, a Mississippi River steamer, and an ironclad.
Wow. Well, yeah, I'm super looking forward to that. That should be awesome. The first video I actually saw of yours was your video on the Battle of Hampton Roads, and that pretty much got me on the hook at that point.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very good battle to cover. It's a very interesting fight, and you know, again, one of the things I like to do on the channel is just not necessarily, I wouldn't say myth bust, because I'm not really in the business of sort of sitting there going, you thought this, but guess what, you were wrong, because that's not really very nice or very fun for anybody. Right. But I do just like to, tell the story as it is and the facts as they are. Definitely. Which does it does mean that occasionally you basically run right over common myths with a bit of a steamroller. And this is, and the Battle of Hampton Roads is one of them. I mean, there's quite a few different ones that you can, that have quite a few different common myths that have grown up around the Battle of Hampton Roads, and a lot of them were addressed in that video. But one of the ones that keeps popping up, even though I specifically addressed it in that video, is the whole thing of monitor firing on half charges. It's like that it's such a common thing. You even see it in a lot of what I call popular history books, the ones that aren't, that sort of, they tell a good story but aren't necessarily that well researched. Right. And yeah, I have to keep pointing out to people, it's like, no, monitor was, because the usual the sort of the corollary to that is then usually, if monitor was firing its full charges, it would have managed to blow through Virginia's armor. And I keep having to point out to people, no, monitor was firing the full charge for its 11-inch Dahlgrens that was specified by the US Navy at the time of the battle. Subsequent to the battle, and in part because of the performance in that battle, Dahlgren himself, the gun designer, gradually upped the charges so that by the end of the American Civil War, the 11 inches were firing with almost twice as much explosive in the barrel as they had been at Hampton Roads. But that's a development when they've realized how well built the Dahlgren guns were. It wasn't a case of, at the time they had full charge and half charge, and they decided to just go with halves. They were firing with everything they had at that point that they believed to be safe.
Very nice.
When you consider that they'd managed to blow up a Secretary of the Navy a few years earlier by overcharging a gun, you can understand why everyone was being just a little bit cautious about what exactly constituted a full charge.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. But yeah, it's been so great having you on, Drunk NFL. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, but I don't want to monopolize your time.
Fair enough.
We've been going for 2 hours, so I think we will call it good for now. But if you have anything else you want to say, plug your channel. I did put your link in the description below to your channel.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead and say anything you want to say is kind of like your final thoughts.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, thank you to everybody who's tuned in and is listening at this point, or maybe listening thereafter. Thanks for stopping by. It's been really fun talking to you. And yeah, if any of you are already viewers of the channel and wondering what on earth happened to the 250k subscriber competition, well, all will be revealed this Sunday in the Dry Dock. So
Very nice.
Tune in for that if you want an opportunity to win shiny prizes.
All right, excellent. Well, we're going to sign off for now. And thank you, everybody, once again. This is Prime signing out.